Okay, from chapter number 10, we just switched to chapter number 12. We just skipped chapter number 11 in the middle. This chapter is related to evolution. So we'll study what evolution really means that we hear so much about. We'll talk about who are at least one or two scientists who are involved in coming up with this theory of evolution. Then we'll see, how evolution does take place. But we will not really go into a whole lot of detail about all of those topics. As we will see actually in the next slide, that we will not be covering every topic of this chapter as well, like we have been doing it for other chapters too. So there is study guide, a sort of study guide that you will see in the next slide. This is, this is the study guide. So as you can see, we will cover the first part, which is part 12.1, evolution acts on populations. The second part is evolutionary thoughts have evolved for centuries. So in that topic, we will cover the contribution of Darwin. We'll see what natural selection means. Then we will see, where we stand today in the modern evolutionary synthesis that took place around 1930s and is still continuing today. Then the next topic we will cover is 12.3, natural selection molds evolution. We will skip part which is 12.4. This is 12.4, and then we will cover 12.5, which is natural selection can shape populations in many ways. And then we'll skip the last two parts of the chapter as well, which are 12.6 and 12.7. So we will just do 12.1, 12.2, 12.3, and 12.5. I think this way it will make it a little bit easy instead of just going after every topic. It will be a little bit easy for us to concentrate from this chapter. Conceptually, evolution starts with some type of a change, some type of a mutation at the genetic level, at the DNA level. Those are called mutations, as you have studied before. So those mutations take place within a population. It does take place in individuals, but really that one individual does and does not matter that much. As long as those mutations are widely present within a population, within the members of a population, then that is what really becomes evolution or the force of evolution later on. That mutation within the population um, results into a smaller group of organisms that are able to interbreed with each other. So they become a new species. Some changes happen in them based on the color, based on their size, but they are not reproductive with other organisms anymore. But that group that is successfully able to reproduce with each other, mate with each other, and reproduce successfully with each other, that really is the driving force of that evolution. And that was coming from the change, the mutation that was taking place within individuals, but many individuals within the same population of those organisms can result into those new type of species that are restrictive among themselves only in terms of the breeding. So you have seen that with many other organisms like horses and donkeys, they are not really very compatible with each other. Even if you force them, they can reproduce to some extent, but their offspring are not very reproductive. They cannot continue to reproduce that way. So that means they are two different species. At some point, they probably had a common ancestor, but some individuals changed due to those mutations in them, and they became completely different from each other to the point where they are not able to reproduce with each other. So that is basically the whole gist of evolution. And how does that evolution take place? Mutation, that's as I described, mutation changes their DNA, and those DNAs result into changes in their alleles. Alleles change, for example, if a population does not have blue eye color, and blue eye color does appear in some individuals of that population, there is a new allele that gets added to that population. If a population of bacteria is not resistant to antibiotic and they do become antibiotic resistant, that is a mutation in that population that makes a new species of bacteria. And we hear that so much actually in the news all the time, that newer species of antibiotic resistant bacteria are discovered on regular basis. That is because of the changes that are taking place in them. So those change those organisms over a period of time, that they are no longer able to reproduce with each other and they become a new species. When we talk about genetics, very briefly, it is a genetic change that happens over a period of time. So one change happens, then another change happens, then more changes can follow that one change, and eventually it can result into a bigger type of evolution, bigger change in which the species they split from the original species. It has not happened with the humans for thousands of years, but it has happened with other organisms. We see the example of bacteria all the time. New types of bacteria are emerging, which are different than the previous bacteria. The older ones were not antibiotic resistant. The newer ones are resistant to antibiotics. All new species that we see now that exist today did not exist in the past, or at least not all of them existed in the past. So those species that existed in the past, they went through some type of mutations, some type of genetic changes in them for a long period of time, and that resulted into what we see today as new species. Within a population is where the evolution takes place. Individuals go through those changes, and those changes result into new types of species in them. We see that in different races as well. People who live, say, in Africa, their eye colors are different. If they develop a new eye color because of the change, that's the type of change I'm talking about. So for example, if majority of the people living in Africa have, dark brown eye color, and among all of those dark brown eye color, if one individual has, say, blue eye color, which may be very unusual because there are other people don't have that color, that's the change. Then it can happen that there may be another person. That person will breed with somebody, have children. Some of them will have blue eye color, some of them will have brown eye color, and the process continues generation after generation. And there could be other changes that are taking place at the same time. So blue eye color is just one example. There could be other changes taking place at the same time. Another change will take place. So when they proceed through many, many years in future, then those can result into different types of species over a long period of time. Within a population, individuals have alleles. So you are familiar with the concept of the alleles. Alleles are the different forms of the same gene. Blue eye color, green eye color, brown eye color, gray eye color, those are all examples of alleles. So each gene that we have in our body that controls some trait has two forms of that allele, because we have two homologous chromosomes, and homologous chromosomes are where those genes are located. This is where those alleles are located. So one individual will have certain types of alleles. Since we have about 20,000+ genes, so that means we can have whatever that number of genes. Let's say for the argument's sake, we say that there are 20,000 genes in humans. Then that means we have 20,000 times 2 number of alleles. So those alleles are the ones that control certain traits in our body. And the presence of certain alleles is considered as the allele frequency, uh, how commonly they are located in one generation and how commonly they are being passed on to the next generation. A race from Asia will have an allele frequency that is passed on to next generation. Scandinavians have allele frequency in them, which may be different than the allele frequency of the Asian, but both of them have those alleles in them that basically defines who they are. That's what really is expressed in their phenotype. This is what we see in them. That's what the phenotype is. Visible appearance or physical form of those things. Allele frequency is calculated by determining the number of copies of an allele in a population, let's say Asian population, by the total number of alleles of the same gene within the population. So number of copies of that an allele, one allele, and the total number of alleles for the same gene within the population that is called allele frequency. That's how frequent they are. That's how abundant they are within a population. And it will vary. Different population will vary in terms of their allele frequencies. Why is it important to talk about allele frequency? Because allele frequency is what really determines whether a population is evolving, is going through evolution or not, or either way, whether it's going through evolution or not. If allele frequency from one generation to 5 generations later and 10 generations later and 100 generations later do not change, what does that mean? Just think that, if the allele frequency today is the same after about 100 years or after about, 200 years, what does that mean? Just think about that. So it really means that evolution is not taking place because the alleles are still the same that existed in that individual, 100 years and 200 years or maybe 100 generations ago or 200 generations ago. That means alleles are not changing. There is no mutation taking place in that population, so it's not evolving. And it is very randomly possible. Evolution is always taking place. It may be just a minor type of evolution, or the major may not be taking place, but the minor is always an ongoing process. So the example I was giving earlier, the gene pool of a population in, say, Sweden is different from a population in Japan or in China or in India. So when that population of Swedish people migrate to some other parts and they marry there in those areas, interbreed with the local people, now the allele frequency that the Swedish people brought to that area is different than when those Swedish people had not migrated to that area. So the gene pool, which is all the genes present in a population, is called gene pool. So the gene pool will change because of the Swedish people will move to a population where they did not exist before. That alleles that they had did not exist there before, so now it has become completely different. Okay, switching to the scientist. So I want actually just to talk about, not actually, there were many brilliant scientists who played big roles like Lamarck and Buffon and Lyell and other people, but these two people actually have probably the greatest influence. Darwin and Wallace, both of them actually did contribute to the theory of evolution. They were not the first one who gave the idea, but they did actually give the idea of today's evolution. So they proposed that the mechanism of evolution that forms the new species. Or the scientists who were before them, they gave the idea of evolution is taking place, even though they have very kind of different ideas. But the contribution of Darwin and Wallace is that they established how the new species are forming. And the real contribution of this person, Darwin, is evolution, and his own contribution, personal contribution, was natural selection. He was the one who gave the idea of natural selection. Natural selection means that some mutations take place in a population, and those populations are selected. They are more desirable. They have better features than the previous features, so now they are more acceptable in that population. That is the contribution of Wallace and Darwin. So how they came to those type of conclusions, not only them but other ones at the same time, was the finding of fossils in different layers of the rocks. So all of these rocks that we see in the form of very different layers, um, all of these layers are based on sedimentation, based on kind of making those layers by depositing some sediment, some rocks and things like that. And whatever animal was buried, whatever animal was killed, died, got covered with those and became mineralized, became fossilized. And those are preserved there. And whenever there is some cutting that we see, like in canyons, deep cuttings because of the water and natural weathering forces, we actually discover lots of different types of bones or teeth, or some footprints, or some barks or leaves and things like that. So people thought that, those animals that are buried deeper and deeper, those were the older animals that existed long time ago, because this process of formation of these layers of rocks will take millions of years. So these rocks carry that history with them. Different layers will give us the idea, and you can actually even date some of those layers. You can put some date, when those levels, when those layers were established. The deepest layers are the ones that were, those were formed millions of years ago, and the ones which are closer to the surface are the ones which are deposited the closest to over time. More recent ones are the ones. So that's why you go deeper and deeper, and actually in some cases we'll probably never be able to actually get to those layers because they are so deep. Most of those tall mountains that we have today, those were at some point underwater. So it's very difficult to actually to go to that deep in them because of all the layers on top of them involved. So Charles Darwin, who was a trained biologist, he got interested in, initially he wanted to become a doctor. So because his father was doctor, his grandfather was doctor, but he was not very successful or not really that much interested in becoming a doctor, got interested in biology. So he got an opportunity to go on a voyage with some other scientists. So it was a long kind of voyage that started from England. Um, and that's the part where it started around 1831. So from here they went down towards south to South America. Um, so from South America, they actually kind of traveled around it, and then they spent a lot of time on Galapagos Islands, which is in Ecuador, very close to Ecuador, right on the equator. So that line shows the equator. So equator is characterized by pretty warm temperature, very consistent throughout the year, uh, but abundance of life is seen on the equator. So here in Africa and in Asia, which actually runs through this equatorial line. So he spent a lot of time in Galapagos Island, and those are a bunch of islands which are shown here in the kind of an image below that. These are a bunch of islands which have been separated from each other by long distances in between, but probably at some point they were all just a piece that existed together. And with the passage of time, they got separated, got filled with water. So now all those organisms that lived in different islands, they were their ancestors were the same at some point. And when they got separated, physically they got separated from each other. They will not be able to actually travel that much to other islands. So they became isolated from each other. That isolation caused them those changes, or some changes took place in them. They became completely different than the organism where they came from. Their ancestors were the same, but because of this physical distance, the temperature is different on different islands, and physically they're separate, so there's no mixing. There's no gene pool which is moving between those islands. So they became completely different from each other. So he observed that, he got a lot of fossils, a lot of evidence, observations. He took a lot of those things with him and analyzed those. It took him about 5 years on that voyage. That started from England, then went down from there to South America. From South America, they kind of went around it, the part of the south, and then they went back towards the part uh, which is Asia, and then from there the voyage continued. Then actually they never went towards India, which is right there on the top here in the Indian Ocean. So they didn't go there, but instead they actually went back towards Africa and then to England from there. This whole voyage kind of took 5 years period of time. Lots of observations, a lot of data, and all of those things really helped them to understand what was going on. He worked with mostly with with the tortoises and with finches. Observations were on many different organisms, but these are the ones that he actually spent a lot of time with. They're observing their beak sizes, and observing what type of food they eat, how they mate with each other, and if there are anything which are kind of common in different finches that live in different islands. So their ancestors were probably the same. They came probably from the same ancestor, but they became completely different after some period of time being in separation from each other. So one of the things that he kind of observed and used in his idea of natural selection is the environment. So environment plays a big role what happens to an individual. We have talked about this concept before. So in genetics, not only genes are important, but also the environment is important. So you may have a gene, but that gene could be modified with the environment. What is environment? Environment could be your food. Environment could be the temperature in that area, or it could be elevation from the sea level, or it could be how close you are. Mostly kind of environmental type of factors, or your food, your diet, your exercise. So, for example, you may be predisposed to a gene in which you will collect a lot of cholesterol in your body. But can you modify it? Yes, you can modify it to some extent by exercising, by avoiding consuming cholesterol in your diet. Or if somebody has diabetes, can they modify their environment? Um, yes, they can. If they eliminate, if they eliminate the consumption of a lot of sugars, and moderate it and control it with insulin and all that, yes, they can modify it. But what if they don't modify it? For example, if somebody who's diabetic does not really control their sugar levels, what will happen? The whole system will collapse. But with their modification, they can survive much longer than those people who don't do that. So environment in his case also played a big difference, and he said that environment chooses or influences those organisms that have certain changes in them um, selectively over other organisms. Some of those organisms may have better features in them that will make them more adaptable. to that environment in which those changes are taking place. Finches living in different islands have different sizes of the beaks. So some islands are very wet, some islands are very dry. So the dryness and wetness of those islands based on their rain will determine the size of the beaks. It's not really that the environment is changing them. Environment is just becoming suitable for them. So that is called natural selection. Natural selection does not force change in a certain way. Natural selection means that things are selected which already exist in that population based on that environment, based on that geography in which those organisms exist. One of the examples that Darwin gave was this artificial selection. So a lot of us are familiar with these different kind of varieties of mustards. So broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, cabbage. There are other ones too. Artichoke is also included here. All of those, bok choy, all of those are kind of examples of the same wild mustard. So how did they become all those different types of these varieties that we consume today? They look very different from each other, aren't they? They are very different from each other. The taste is very different from each other also. Their nutritional value is very different from each other also. So all of those are selected by humans. When people started to live in the form of communities, they started to grow things, started to bring things closer to them. Animals, wolves were started to be domesticated. Plants, whatever they see, their food, they have, humans started to actually bring them closer to them to themselves so that they can actually have some control on the growth of those things. And the same thing happened whenever they would see some changes taking place in those types of things that they consume, they would select them. And that resulted into all of those different types of varieties that we consume today. That is very artificial selection that is done by the humans based on what they really want to see in their fruits and vegetables. All varieties of fruits and vegetables have gone through some level of this type of selection in them. Such type of artificial selection is also seen in case of animal breeding, especially in case of dogs. People actually select dog breeders. They select based on several different features that they are looking for to include in their different breeds, because they know there are certain conditions, there are certain infections or certain chances of cancers or dwarfism or other types of orders and disorders are present in them. So they use them in their population. They select and they avoid some of those breeds that bring more chances of different types of congenital type of diseases, that are organisms or animals are born with. So there is a form of the artificial selection that is being done for many, many years now in case of animals as well as in plants. So Darwin proposed natural selection as a means for evolution. It's a mechanism of evolution. Changes happen in organisms, and those changes, and many changes happen randomly. There is no control how those changes take place. Whenever UV light hits your body, it causes mutations. So, and you cannot control that. You can modify it, but you cannot really control that mechanism. So those genetic variations happen naturally and very randomly. And those variations within those organisms, some of those are desirable, some of those are undesirable. Some of those variations are more adapted to a certain environmental condition. So those are the ones that become more successful in that environmental condition. In the nature where all organisms live, there are limited resources of food and shelter and water. Everything is limited. Even mating partners is not the supply of mating partners in case of birds and animals is not very abundant. They are in short supply, um, and then always there is overproduction of organisms, but not the environment cannot support all organisms, all babies that are born within a population. Just imagine, even in Fayetteville, if all the deer babies that are born in a season, they are allowed to live. If they are allowed to survive for a longer period of time, then almost there will be no vegetation left in that area. So that's why actually hunting is open every year with the limited number of animals that can be killed, because overproduction always takes place in case of in different environment. So this is what is seen naturally. These are the things that Mendel basically observed naturally, and what we drew from those observations in nature, that there is a struggle for existence. So organisms compete with each other for resources. Some organisms are more successful in reproducing, in finding their partners than the other ones. So that means they are naturally selected. If somebody or some organism is able to find more partners, have more offspring, then naturally has some qualities of surviving and reproducing which are not found in other organisms. So that is a natural selection that is taking place. So, some buck is more handsome, stronger, and younger than the other ones. So we will be able to mate with more females. We'll be able to have more offspring from those females. Others who may be older, weaker, may have some horn broken or something. So they will not really attract that many females. And then, as organisms go down to subsequent generations, things change in them, natural selection selects them, but there are those changes that are passed on to the next generations. And these changes continue to happen in those organisms, generation after generation. And a point comes where the new type of species arise from these organisms, that is called descent with modification. They pass their genes to the next generation, and next generations are different than the previous generations, to the point where they become completely different than their ancestors. When they become completely different than their ancestors, they become new species. And once they become new species, then of course they are not able to breed back to where they came from, to their ancestors, because they have become genetically very different from their ancestors. So that was what was done by Darwin and Wallace, who laid the foundation of the evolutionary theory. So that happened towards the end of the 19th century. Then a lot of new developments were taking place between the time when Darwin died and other generation of scientists came after them. Genetics was started pretty much at the same time, and then DNA was so then the genes were discovered. People started to understand organisms more, and then another about 30 years or so was a time which is regarded as the modern evolutionary uh, synthesis theory. That is comprised of the modern science now, proteins and DNA. So DNA, DNA was discovered before 1953. The model was finally presented in 1953, but it was discovered before that, towards the end of the century, of the 20th century, and then more work was done, and eventually a modern evolutionary synthesis is based on the changes that take place, which Mendel or Darwin had no idea. At that time, DNA was not there, chromosomes were not there. People understood about the cells, but that's about it. So, so that era, that started, around 1930s or so is based on DNA. Now we know now the chapter that we covered on DNA replication and transcription and translation, we know the role of DNA. Any change that takes place at the DNA level is reflected in messenger RNA and then in the proteins, because proteins, DNA makes RNAs like messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA through the process of translation, right? If you said translation, you were right. So that process is to form proteins. Proteins can be formed or are formed from messenger RNA along with others. That's what we studied um, in a previous chapter now. So any change that takes place at the DNA level, that's the genetic change, and it changes everything that comes after that. Proteins are formed from the DNA, and that DNA change or mutation is the basis of evolution. So from there till the present time of today, 2020, is when we have seen great progress in science. We understand our own genome very well. We know what we are made of, how many proteins roughly we have, and to some extent we understand the disease process. We have not been able to control it yet as human beings, as scientists, but a lot of discoveries have been made, and it is all based on the discovery of the DNA in 1950s. The structure was presented in 1953 by Watson and Crick, but whatever progress we are seeing today is based on pretty much that happened there, along with what really uh, was produced by these scientists and other lineages of scientists that came from the genetics point of view. So we are seeing the best time ever in the history of science with the progress. And right in the middle of all of that is evolution. Evolution explains a lot of things. Evolution kind of ties down lots of things too. Um, so evolution is considered as one of those sciences, one of those areas that are considered as uh, uh, that considered as the kind of binding force, in which that explains a lot of things. That explains how life started with a single organism and how it resulted, how it started with the single organism, single cell organism, which were probably bacteria and archaea, and how they became eukaryotes. So that resulted into the more complex forms of reptiles and amphibians and mammals. So modern evolutionary synthesis includes uh, all of those scientists who made some progress after Mendel and Darwin. So we know that heritable traits are passed in our DNA. Any changes in DNA are mutations, and mutations are passed on to the next generation through the process of sexual reproduction, um, and those mutations are also the fuel for those mutations are genetic variations, and that is the fuel for evolution. That really results into evolution. A lot of time, evolution is not very well understood. Um, So especially when non-scientists try to explain the theory of evolution, things get a little bit more complicated. It's like going to a doctor and trying to find out how to fix a car, or other way around. If you go to a doctor and ask them how to fix your carburetor, of course you will not, even if that doctor tries to give you some answer, but will not be able to give you a satisfactory answer. So one of the misconceptions about theory of evolution, just I said theory of evolution. Evolution is not a fact. Evolution is based on many different types of evidences. So it is not a fact. It's not like theory of it's not actually like gravity. Gravity is a fact, right? But evolution is, because we cannot repeat it, we cannot test the theory of evolution or evolution on scientific method. Can we do experiments on things that happened, 2 million years ago or even 10 years ago or so? No, we cannot. Those organisms that existed 1 million years ago or 100,000 years ago, we can only know about them through some fossilized evidence, but nothing else is available on them. So one of the kind of misconception is that evolution, biological evolution explains the origin of life. People think that, okay, well, if we believe that evolution happened, how about how did the life start? Theory of evolution does not really explain how life started. Theory of evolution is based on once life got started, what happened to it, how things change after that. And evolution is not a controlled process. It's a very random process. Things happen by themselves. Things are not controlled. If, for example, if I want to become taller, I cannot become taller. I may be able to get, some hormones and things like that, growth hormones, and do exercise and all that, control my diet. I may have become a little bit taller when I was younger, when I was growing. Um, but otherwise, it's not a controlled process. Evolution is not a controlled process. So organisms do not desire to become something. Um, and many different changes happen in organisms. Some of those happen to adopt better than the other ones, and those that adopt better, those are desirable features in those organisms that make them survive much better than the other ones, so they become successful in that environment. As I explained in the previous slide, natural selection does not create new types of mutations. It just selects whatever is made available. So whatever mutations take place in a population, it just selects the ones which are more suitable for that environment. On the image on the right side, there is an organism. Some of you are probably able to see it because of the tiny eye. This is a seahorse, and this seahorse is very well blended to its background, to its environment, which is the sea corals. So sea corals have the same type of phenotype, same type of external features in them. The color also blends very well. So when about millions of years ago, when these mutations were taking place that were giving rise to new forms of these seahorses, this got very well adapted because it blends in very well with the background. So the sea corals that we see around it have the very similar types of features. Colors are also very similar. So predators will not be able to spot them very easily. So they will survive better when they have this kind of surviving better than the others. That means their population will increase. They will have more children. Their children will survive. Their offspring will survive better than the other ones. So they will become more successful in that environment. But it will take millions of years, and it will take many different forms of these organisms arising, many of them not being successful, others being successful. So at the end, the final product is what we see now. Those are the ones that probably were the most successful under those environmental conditions. Now that's why they are the most successful. That's why we are seeing them in the waters of today. Many more organisms are born than what they can survive. because environment can support only so much. It's based on space, based on the nesting space, based on the food available. So space and food and all those resources are very limiting. So not everything can survive, even if they are adapted very well, but they can produce many more, but they will not all survive in a certain environment. There could be, millions and millions of seeds being produced in a dandelion in your own backyard. But just imagine if all of them they fall on the ground and they germinate and start producing weeds. What will we see around us? Only the weeds. Nothing else will be able to be supported because the soil will not be able to provide nutrients to everything that is falling on the ground. So we will not see all these different forms of life that we see today if everything started to survive. Adaptations that are kind of acceptability of the changed features in organisms whenever some changes take place in organisms, and through the process of natural selection, adaptations or acceptability takes place of those changes. That's what really kind of drives this whole process of evolution, adaptation. um, so those heritable features make them desirable. Those organisms, those males or females that are more productive, that produce more gametes, are more successful. If somebody is not able to reproduce that successfully and others are able to, they have more children, so they will be able to kind of survive through their children better than the people who have low counts of certain gametes in their body. The example of bacteria that are becoming more and more antibiotic resistant is a natural selection mechanism that is going on. So that mutation is taking place naturally and very randomly. So just imagine here, the process is shown here. This case here, this is a natural population of bacteria that has a natural DNA in them, and that bacteria will continue to reproduce, and they are killed by antibiotics. Um, but something happens to only one of those. Some change happens, some mutation takes place at their DNA level, and only one out of those millions of bacteria have gone through that mutation. So when that bacterium, that new bacterium, exists among all other bacteria that are not antibiotic resistant, but those are antibiotic susceptible. So when antibiotic is used against those bacteria, then all others will not be able to survive. All the green ones will perish, and the only one that will survive is the red one. And the red, since there is no competition left now for the red one, all the other ones that were much more abundant have disappeared. The only one that will survive is the red one. So that will reproduce. They will use all the resources available. That means natural selection has played a role in making that one red bacterium be adapted to that environmental condition in which that bacterium is surviving. And antibiotic resistant bacteria are appearing in the hospitals. So can you see the connection there? Why are they arising in hospitals where those bacteria should be killed? People go there to get antibiotic treatments or get treatments against viruses and bacteria and all that. So why are they surviving there? Why they are becoming antibiotic resistant? Because there is more exposure, there is more use of antibiotics inside the hospitals than the outside. So those bacteria appear in different hospitals because of the use that eliminates all the ones which are susceptible to antibiotics, and only those survive that are resistant to bacterium. Natural selection playing role, and natural selection is making them more adaptable. So whenever mutation takes place, that is a new type of allele is appearing in that population. That allele that did not exist before, now it is there. That allele is to make those bacteria antibiotic resistant. So a new population arises. Just imagine if these type of mutations happen, several other mutations happen, then this bacterium will become a completely new type of organism, a new type of species. So any type of adaptation that seems to be perfect fit for one environment may be completely uh, and unfit in a different environment. So for example, these turtles that we hear from time to time so much, their mothers have not really learned not to lay their eggs, far from the water. What happens is that they lay their eggs, away from the tidal zone where water does not interfere with the hatching of the eggs, and there's a large distance in between their nest and the water. So those tiny turtles, when they come out, they lay about 200 eggs or so. So when they come out, all those tiny babies, they rush toward the water and guess what happens at that time. You might have seen some videos. There are seagulls that are sitting there waiting for that time. So the moment they start coming out of the nest, they actually pick them up, and hardly, you know, one or two from the one nest is able to survive. Uh, so that is actually a bad example. That's not really natural selection adapting this feature in the turtles to survive. But the thing is that the way it is compensated, how is it compensated? It is compensated by the production of large number of eggs. So out of those eggs, if a couple of those are still able to make it to the water, that is enough for them. Because there are so many of those females laying eggs and have their nests around. So if some of them survive, that is still good enough for that species to survive. But if the nest was closer, just imagine if the nest is closer, what are the implications of that? If the eggs are present here, they hatch out from those eggs, and most of them will be able to probably make it because seagulls can eat so fast. They can eat only so many of those in a small period of time. So some of them will be able to make it very quickly. But would that nest be able to survive here? Because if it is very close to the water, water will come and actually expose them. So they will not be able to hatch out. The warmth will not reach them. So that is a kind of some type of adjustment that has not happened in case of turtles. So if new type of features, new type of alleles do not arise in some of the species that can make them more adaptable in certain environment, then that can actually become the reason of their downfall. We have been hearing, and that those organisms become extinct. Recently, we heard about white rhinos. White rhinos have become extinct. One type of white rhinos are completely extinct. There are no males or females left. In other species, there are some only males left. So, how good are the males only? They are, they did not become very reproductive. So they produce only one baby that too after a few years or so, and if that baby survives, then they're still okay. But that, many cases, that baby does not survive. If that baby survives, then poachers, human beings are there to hunt them for their horns. They make some medicine from those horns. They use them in so many different ways. But the result of that is that they have become extinct, and many species have become extinct like that because they had some of the kind of good, desirable adaptation features missing in them. And when they are missing, then they are not very well adapted and they become extinct. In other cases, some adaptability, some modifications have taken place in some organisms, like the ones that pollinate orchids. These wasps are almost the same shape as the flowers. So this flower is at the bottom. Um, this is the flower here, an orchid flower. A type of orchid flower is here, and that orchid flower is very well adapted to this wasp. These wasps and orchids have kind of lived together for many, many, many years, and they have evolved together. Now they are a perfect fit. Uh, so they did not really change based on the features of the other organism. It's just the evolution. They actually produce those alleles, produce those mutations that make them fit perfectly well with each other. Okay, the last topic of this section, in which we are talking about the natural selection as a mode of evolution. So another concept is fitness. Fitness is not the same fitness that we are familiar with. If you pump a lot of iron, if you pump a lot of different types of hormones and kind of banned substances, you develop much bigger muscles. You look much fitter. You have those six packs and all that. So it is not the same fitness in case of evolution. Fitness, it means that uh, ability to reproduce. An organism is more fit if he or she has better ability to produce more offspring. That way they will be able to add more to their own population, and they will be able to survive through their offspring to the next generation. So that organism is more fit than the other ones. I think this is the last topic we're going to cover from this chapter. So this is related to what is on page 228. Natural selection can shape population in many ways. So there are three ways natural selection, which is a way of selecting the existing mutations that take place within the individuals of a population. Natural selection can move things in a certain way by selecting those phenotypes that make those organisms adapt much better to the environment. So, the first one is called directional selection. The second one is called disruptive selection, and the third one is called stabilizing selection. So these are the three modes. These are the three types of selections that move the phenotypes in a certain way. So let's see actually those individually. The first one is the directional selection. So directional selection means one phenotype is favored over other phenotypes. That's why it is directional, based on towards kind of darker color or taller height or brighter color, or I don't know, long nose, more flowers, any of those which are taking only towards one side and not both sides. That is called a directional type of a selection. So for example, these moths actually live on the trees. The bark of the tree could be lighter in color. In some trees, the bark is very light in color. In other cases, the bark of the tree is fairly dark in color. These moths that could be of different colors. So some moths are very light in color. Some moths are kind of medium in color, and some moths are very dark in color. So that is a normal distribution within a population. Some white, kind of some darker, some the medium in between the dark and the light color. So very normal type of distribution you see in this curve that indicate this curve that we see here, bell-shaped curve, is very normal distribution. Majority of the organisms are in the middle because they are kind of a medium color in between light and dark. So they are able to survive much better than either in most of the trees, because some trees are lighter, some are darker, and these moths actually can blend in on both of them to some extent. They are not very easy to be spotted. So a directional type of selection will be whenever, for example, the environment changes, and there are more trees left now in that environment, which are darker with their bark color. The darker trees are surviving. So within the population of moths, which are light color or medium color or dark color, the one that will survive better are the ones that have darker color in them. Again, because they will not be picked up by the predators so much, they will camouflage quite well against their background of the dark bark color. So that means more which are darker color will be able to survive. That way, the natural selection is moving the population in that direction. It's favoring that one color so that they can survive much better. Another example, another type of selection is disruptive selection. In this case here, within the population, two different extreme conditions are selected. So, uh, in this case here, these snails have they have different colors also, just like the moths that we saw in the previous example. Whenever the conditions are kind of normal, then the medium types of colors are selected against the darker or the lighter one, because the number of individuals is much lower for the lighter and darker color. But whenever the condition changes, now that condition favor the two different types of background. One, which is lighter color, survives in those areas which are very well lit, where the background is kind of lighter color, or the second group that will survive much better, having more individuals survive because the background is dark and they are dark in color as well. So now they're, instead of selecting only one type, this type of selection is selecting two types of organisms, one which are very light in color, one extreme, and the other one which is the darkest one, the second extreme. So that way, both of them will be selected, and there will be two kind of populations going on, one in the background or in the area of the forest which is very well lit, or maybe open fields, another one which is deep inside the ocean, deep inside the forest, where the light is not very easily accessible. So those will be favored in those areas, and both of them will be surviving simultaneously. Another type of selection is called stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection mean that the medium type is selected over the other ones, because in this case here, this one is the majority. So what happens in case of babies, when the babies are very small, the chances of their survival, if the size is very small at the time of the birth, if they are preemies, if they're born after about 5-6 months or so, then the chances of them surviving is low. And when they're very large, so when they're very large, chances of them surviving and their mother surviving at the same time, if they develop those big heads, if they stay in longer inside the mothers, then their heads become much bigger. They actually struggle through, and some of them do not survive because of their own size. So they are relatively lower, but the medium-sized ones, 8 to 9 pounds babies are the majority of the babies that are born. They survive much better. So since they survive much better, mortality is lower. So natural selection will favor that size. That's why majority of the babies that are born are within that range. So there's no need to modify uh, through the natural selection in this case. There is more emphasis on the medium size in this case. So that is called stabilizing type of selection. It is not moving in one direction, which is called a directional selection, or moving in two different directions, selecting two different extremes, which is called disruptive selection. And in this case here, stabilizing is the medium size, which is much more successful than the other two. So one of the things that we see, which may be somewhat related to this type of selection. So one type of the kind of a more stabilizing type of selection. So in one case, heterozygotes actually are advantageous. The kind of a medium type of a situation where one allele. So if you remember the definition of heterozygote. Heterozygous condition is that in which the two alleles are different. One is dominant and other is recessive. And homozygous was the condition in which both alleles were either dominant, both, or both recessive. So heterozygotes are those that have one dominant and one recessive allele. Sometimes actually that condition is advantageous over homozygous condition. Why is that? So, for example, in case of sickle cell anemia, people who are sickle cell anemic, either they are either homozygous or they are heterozygous or they are homozygous for recessive condition. They are homozygous for dominant or homozygous for recessive, and other ones are the ones in the middle, and the one in the middle are the ones which are heterozygotes. Those are considered as carriers. So sickle cell anemia is pretty debilitating type of a disease. So if somebody is homozygous recessive for both alleles, they usually don't survive uh, till they become adults. Most of them actually they die before they are able to reproduce. The ones which are homozygous dominant, of course, they don't have any mutation in them, so they are normal people. And the people who are heterozygous, they have some conditions. They have some difficulties from time to time, especially whenever they find themselves in those conditions where they are exercising or where their oxygen is low in concentration. So they struggle a little bit there. They have swollen knees, enlarged spleen, and other conditions in them too. That is a single mutation. Only one nucleotide, only one DNA sequence is changed in them that causes sickle cell anemia. So it is advantageous in the parts of Africa where malaria is very common. Malaria is a very deadly disease, kills somewhere between 500,000 to about 1 million people every year. Very common in Africa and parts of the Asia as well. So malaria lives in red blood cells. Sickle cell anemia is also a disease of blood cells. So in case of heterozygous, those individuals have two types of red blood cells. So the normal red blood cells will be like these, that are a little bit compressed in the middle, and they are a little bit enlarged from the side. The sickle cell that have that sickle cell condition, they become the sickle cells. So meaning that they are not able to carry that much oxygen in them. Now, since the parasite of malaria lives in red blood cells also, so that parasite cannot survive inside the sickle cell. So meaning that malaria is much more deadly disease than sickle cell anemia. So this way, the people who are carriers, who are heterozygotes for sickle cell condition, they are able to survive even though they have some difficulties, but they are able to survive because malaria will not be able, or the parasite of malaria will not be able to grow in them. So their life is spared by giving them some difficulties because of some conditions of sickle cell anemia. So that is actually one advantage. There are other diseases that are like that as well, where individuals get some advantage when they are heterozygous. So sickle cell anemia is because of this when both alleles are recessive alleles. So that does not support the growth of, so in this case here, actually those people usually die because they are heterozygous, they are homozygous for recessive, homozygous dominant are normal, but where the individuals actually that get advantage are these two, which are heterozygous for this condition. One big D, one little d. So same thing here, one big D, one little d. So both of those are the ones that get advantage. So they don't develop malaria because parasite cannot live inside the red blood cells. So they are spared of malaria by giving them some type of discomfort.